Hi everyone, this is Terry again from Koala-Krafts. Just going to read another section of Gone with the Wind. This will be number 12, and I'm working on my Heaven and Earth design. This is the first one to guess which picture it is wins a $25 gift card from Treasure Studios Art. So I suppose we'll get going. Even with Honey, with whom she had an unspoken understanding of marriage when he came into his property next fall, he was diffident and silent. At times he had an ungallant feeling that Honey's coitus and proprietary airs were not a credit to him, for she was so boy crazy he imagined she would use them on any man who gave her the opportunity. Charles was not excited over the prospect of marrying her, for she stirred in him none of the emotions of the wild romance that his beloved books had assured him were proper for a lover. He had always yearned to be loved by someone beautiful, dashing creature, full of fire and mischief, and here was Scarlett O'Hara teasing him about breaking her heart. He tried to think of something to say and couldn't. Silently he blessed her because she kept up a steady chatter which relieved him of any necessity for conversation. It was too good to be true. "Now you wait right here till I come back, for I want to eat barbecue with you. And don't you go off philandering with those other girls, because I'm mighty jealous," came the incredible words from red lips with a dimple on each side, and briskly black lashes swept demurely over her green eyes. "I won't," he finally managed to breathe, never dreaming that she was thinking he looked like a calf waiting for the butcher. Tapping him lightly on the arm with a folded fan, she turned to start up the stairs, and her eyes again fell on the man called Rhett Butler, who stood alone a few feet away from Charles. Evidently he had overheard the whole conversation, for he grinned up at her as maliciously as a tom-cat. And again his eyes went over her in a gaze totally devoid of deference she was accustomed to. "God's nightgown," said Scarlett to herself in indignation, using Gerald's favourite oath. "He looks as if he knew what it took. He knew what I looked like without my shimmy." And tossing her head, she went up the steps. In the bedroom where the wraps were laid, she found Catherine Calvert preening before the mirror and biting her lips to make them look redder. Where there were fresh roses in her sash that matched her cheeks, and her cornflower blue eyes were dancing with excitement. Kathleen said Scarlett, trying to pull the corsage of her dress higher. "Who is that nasty man downstairs named Butler?" "My dear, don't you know?" whispered Kathleen excitedly, a weather eye on the next room where Dulcie and the Wilkes girls' mammy were gossiping. "I can't imagine how Mr. Wilkes must feel having him here. But he was visiting Mr. Kennedy in Jonesboro, something about buying cotton. And of course Mr. Kennedy had to bring him along with him. He couldn't just go off and leave him." "What is the matter with him?" "My dear, he isn't received." "Not really?" "No." Scarlett digested this in silence, for she had never before been under the same roof with anyone who was not received. It was very exciting. "What did he do?" "Oh, Scarlett, he has the most terrible reputation. His name is Rhett Butler, and he's from Charleston, and his folks are some of the nicest people there, but they won't even speak to him. Caro Rhett told me about him last summer. He isn't any kin to her family, but she knows all about him. Everybody does. He was expelled from West Point, imagine, and for things too bad for Caro to know. And then there was that business about the girl he didn't marry. Oh, do tell me." "Darling, don't you know anything?" Caro told me all about it last summer, and her mama would die if she thought Caro even knew about it. Well, Mr. Butler took a Charleston girl out buggy riding. I never did know who she was, but I've got my suspicions. She couldn't have been very nice, or she wouldn't have gone out with him in the late afternoon without a chaperone. And my dear, they stayed out nearly all night and walked home finally, saying the horse had run away and smashed the buggy and they had gotten lost in the woods. And guess what? I can't guess, tell me, said Scarlett enthusiastically, hoping for the worst. He refused to marry her the next day. Oh, Scarlett said, her hopes dashed. He said he hadn't done anything to her and he didn't see why he should marry her. And of course, her brother called him out, and Mr. Butler said he'd rather be shot than marry a stupid fool. And so they fought a duel, and Mr. Butler shot the girl's brother, and he died. And Mr. Butler had to leave Charleston, and now nobody receives him, finished Kathleen triumphantly. And just in time, for Delcy came back into the room to oversee the toilet of a charge. Did she have a baby? whispered Scarlett in Catherine's ear. Catherine shook her head violently, but she was ruined just the same, she hissed back. I wish I had gotten Ashley to compromise me, thought Scarlett suddenly. He'd be too much of a gentleman not to marry me. But somehow unbidden, she had a feeling of respect for Rhett Butler for refusing to marry a girl who was a fool. Scarlett sat on a high rosewood ottoman under the shade of a huge oak in the rear of the house, her flounces and ruffles billowing about her and 2 inches of green Morocco slippers. As all that a lady could show and still remain a lady peeping from beneath them. She had scarcely touched plate in her hand and 7 cavaliers about her. The barbecue had reached its peak and the warm air was full of laughter and talk. The click of silver on porcelain and the rich heavy smells of roasting meats, the redolent gravies. Occasionally, when the slight breeze veered, puffs of smoke from the long barbecue pits floated over the crowd and were greeted with squeals of mock dismay from the ladies and violent flapping of palmetto fans. Most of the young ladies were seated with partners on the long benches and faced the tables, but Scarlett, realising that a girl has only 2 sides and only one man can sit on each of these sides, had elected to sit apart so she could gather about her as many men as possible. Under the arbour sat the married women, their dark dresses decorous notes in the surrounding colour and gaiety. Matrons, regardless of their ages, always grouped together apart from the bright-eyed girls, bows and laughter, for there were no married belles in the south. From Grandma Fontaine, who was belching frankly with the privilege of her age, to 17-year-old Alice Munro, struggling against her nausea of a first pregnancy. They had their heads together in endless genealogical and obstetrical discussions, and that made such gatherings very pleasant and instructive affairs. Casting contemptuous glances at them, Scarlett thought that they looked like a clump of fat crows. Married women never had any fun. It did not occur to her that if she married Ashley, she would automatically be relegated to the arbours and front parlours, with staid matrons in dull silks, as staid and dull as they and not a part of the fun and frolicking. Like most girls, her imagination carried her just as far as the altar and no further. Besides, she was too unhappy now to pursue an abstraction. She dropped her eyes to a plate and nibbled daintily on a beaten biscuit, with an elegance and an utter lack of appetite that would have won Mammy's approval. For all that she had an superfluidity of beaux, she had never been more miserable in her life. In some way that she could not understand, her plans of last night had failed utterly so far as Ashley was concerned. She had attracted other beaux by the dozens, but not Ashley, and all the fears of yesterday afternoon were sweeping back upon her, making her heart beat fast then slow, and colour flame and whiten in her cheeks. Ashley had made no attempt to join the circle about her. In fact, she had not had a word alone with him since arriving, or even spoken to him since their first greeting. He had come forward to welcome her when she came into the back garden, but Melanie had been on his arm then, Melanie who hardly came up to his shoulder. She was a tiny, frailly built girl who gave the appearance of a child masquerading in her mother's enormous hoop skirts, an illusion that was heightened by the shy, almost frightened look in her two large brown eyes. She had a cloud of curly dark hair which was so sternly repressed beneath a net that no vagrant tendrils escaped, and this dark mass with its long widow peak accentuated the heart shape of her face. Too wide across the cheekbones, too pointed at the chin. It was sweet, timid face, but a plain face, and she had no feminine tricks of allure to make observers forget its plainness. She looked and was as simple as earth, as good as bread, as transparent as spring water, but for all her plainness of feature and smallness of stature, there was sedate dignity about her movements, and that was oddly touching and far older than her 17 years. Her grey organdy dress with a cherry-coloured satin sash, disguised with its billows and ruffles how childishly undeveloped her body was, and the yellow hat with long cherry streamers had made her creamy skin glow. Her heavy ear bobs with their long gold fringe hung down from loops of tidily netted hair, swinging close to her brown eyes that had the still gleam of forest pool in winter when brown leaves shine up through quiet water. She had smiled with timid liking when she greeted Scarlett and told her how pretty her green dress was, and Scarlett had been hard put to be even civil in reply. So violently did she want to speak alone with Ashley. Since then, Ashley had sat on a stool at Melanie's feet, apart from the other guests, and talked quietly with her, smiling the slow, drowsy smile that Scarlett loved. What made matters worse was that under his smile a little sparkle had come into Melanie's eyes, so that even Scarlett had to admit that she looked almost pretty. As Melanie looked at Ashley, her plain face lit up with an inner fire, for if ever a loving heart showed itself upon a face, it was showing now on Melanie Hamilton's. Scarlett tried to keep her eyes from these two, but could not, and after each glance she redoubled her gaiety with the cavaliers, laughing and saying daring things, teasing, tossing her head at their compliments until her earrings danced. She said fiddly-dee many times, declared that the truth wasn't in any of them, and vowed that she'd never believe anything any man told her. But Ashley did not seem to notice her at all. He only looked up at Melanie and talked on, and Melanie looked down at him with an expression that radiated the fact that she belonged to him. So Scarlett was miserable. To the outward eye, never had a girl less cause to be miserable. She was undoubtedly the belle of the barbecue, the centre of attention. The furore was causing among the men, coupled with the heart burnings of other girls, would have pleased her enormously at any other time. Charles Hamilton, emboldened by her notice, was firmly planted on her right, refusing to be dislodged by combined efforts of the Tarleton twins. He held her fan in one hand and his untouched plate of barbecue in the other, and stubbornly refused to meet the eyes of Honey, who seemed on the verge of an outburst of tears. Cade lounged gracefully on her left, plucking at her skirt to attract her attention, and staring up with smouldering eyes at Stuart. Already the air was electric between him and the twins. The rude words had passed. Frank Kennedy fussed about like a hen with one chick, running back and forward from the shade of the oak to the tables and fetched dainties to tempt Scarlett, as if there were not a dozen servants there for that purpose. As a result, Sue Ellen's sullen resentment had passed beyond the point of ladylike concealment, and she glowered at Scarlett. Small Corinne could have cried because of all Scarlett's encouraging words that morning. Brent had done no more than say "Hello, sis," and jerk her hair ribbon before turning his full attention to Scarlett. Usually he was so kind and treated her with the careless deference that made her feel grown up, and Corinne secretly dreamed of the day when she would put her hair up and her skirts down and receive him as a real beau. And now it seemed that Scarlett had him. The Munro girls were concealing their chagrin at the defection of the swarthy Fontaine boys, but were annoyed at the way Tony and Alex stood about the circle, jockeying for a position near Scarlett, should any of the others arise from their places. They telegraphed their disapproval of Scarlett's contact to Hetty Tarleton by delicately raised eyebrows. Fast was the only word for Scarlett. Simultaneously, the three young ladies raised lacy parasols, said they had quite enough to eat, thank you, and laying light fingers on the arms of the men nearest them, clamoured secretly to see the rose garden, the spring and the summer house. This strategic retreat in good order was not lost on women present or observed by a man. Scarlett giggled as she saw three men dragged out of the line of her charms to investigate landmarks familiar to the girls from childhood, and cut her eyes sharply to see if Ashley had taken note. But he was playing with the ends of Melanie's sash and smiling up at her. Pain twisted Scarlett's heart. She felt that she could claw Melanie's ivory skin until blood ran, and take pleasure in doing it. As her eyes wandered from Melanie, she caught the gaze of Rhett Butler, who was not mixing with the crowd, but standing apart talking to John Wilkes. He had been watching her, and when he looked at him, he laughed outright. Scarlett had an uneasy feeling that this man, who was not received, was the only one present who knew what lay behind her wild gaiety, and that it was affording him sardonic amusement. She could have clawed him with pleasure too. If I can just live through this barbecue till this afternoon, she thought, all the girls will go upstairs to take naps to be fresh for tonight, and I'll stay downstairs and get to talk to Ashley. Surely he must have noticed how popular I am. She soothed her heart with another hope. Of course he has to be attentive to Melanie, because after all she is his cousin, and she isn't popular at all. And if he didn't look out for her, she'd be just a wallflower. She took new courage at this thought and redoubled her efforts in the direction of Charles, whose brown eyes glowed down eagerly at her. It was a wonderful day for Charles, a dream day, and he had fallen in love with Scarlett with no effort at all. Before this new emotion, Honey receded into the dim haze. Honey was a shrill-voiced sparrow and Scarlett a gleaming hummingbird. She teased him and favoured him and asked him questions and answered them herself, so that he appeared very clever without having to say a word. The other boys were puzzled and annoyed by her obvious interest in him, for they knew Charles was too shy to hitch 2 consecutive words together, and politeness was being severely strained to conceal their growing rage. Everyone was smouldering, and it would have been positive triumph for Scarlett, except for Ashley. When the last forkful of pork and chicken and mutton had been eaten, Scarlett hoped the time had come when India would rise and suggest that the ladies retire to the house. It was 2 o'clock and the sun was warm overhead, but India, wearied with the 3-day preparations for the barbecue, was only too glad to remain sitting beneath the arbour, shouting remarks to a deaf old gentleman from Phaetonville. A lazy somnolence descended on the crowd. The blacks idled about, clearing the long tables on which the food had been laid. The laughter and talking became less animated, and groups here and there fell silent. They were waiting for their hostess to signal the end of the morning's festivities. Palmetto fans were wagging more slowly, and several gentlemen were nodding from the heat and overloaded stomachs. The barbecue was over, and all were content to take their ease while sun was at its height. In this interval between the morning party and the evening ball, they seemed a placid, peaceful lot. Only the young men retained the relentless energy which had filled the whole throng a short while before. Moving from group to group, drawling in their soft voices, they were as handsome as blooded stallions and as dangerous. The languor of midday had taken hold of the gathering, but underneath lurked tempers that could rise to killing heights in a second and flare out as quickly. Men and women, they were beautiful and wild, all a little violent under their pleasant ways and only a little tamed. Some time dragged by while the sun grew hotter, and Scarlett and the others looked again toward India. Conversation was dying out when in the lull everyone in the grove heard Gerald's voice raised in furious accents. Standing some little distance away from the barbecue tables, he was at a peak of an argument with John Wilkes. "God's nightgown, man. Pray for a peaceable settlement with the Yankees after we've fired on the rascals at Fort Sumter. Peaceable? The South should show by arms that she cannot be insulted, and that she's not leaving the Union by the Union's kindness, but by her own strength." "Oh my God," thought Scarlett, "he's done it. Now we'll all sit here till midnight." In an instant, the Solomons had fled from the lounging throng, and something electric went snapping through the air. The men sprung from the benches and chairs, arms in wide gestures, voices clashing for the night to be heard above the voices. There had been no talk of politics or impending war all during the morning because of Mr. Wilkes's request that the ladies should not be bored. But now Gerald had bawled the words, "Fort Sumter," and every man present forgot his host's ammunition. Of course we'll fight. Yankee thieves. We could lick them in a month. Why, one southerner can lick 20 Yankees. Teach them a lesson they won't soon forget. Peaceably? That won't let us go in peace. No, look how Mr. Lincoln insulted our commissioners. Yes, kept them hanging around for weeks, swearing he'd have a Sumter evacuated. They want war. We'll make them sick of war. And above all the voices Gerald boomed, all Scarlett could hear was states, rights by God, shouted over and over. Gerald was having an excellent time, but not his daughter. Succession War. These words long since had become acutely boring to Scarlett from much repetition. But now she hated the sound of them, for they meant that the men would stand there for hours, hanging one another, and she would have no chance to corner Ashley. Of course there would be no war, and the men all knew it. They just loved to talk and hear themselves talk. Charles Hamilton had not risen with the others, and finding himself comparatively alone with Scarlett, he leaned closer and, with a daring born of new love, whispered a confession. Miss O'Hara, I had recently decided that if we did fight, I'd go over to South Carolina and join the troop there. It's said that Mr. Wayne Hampton is organising a cavalry troop, and of course I would want to go with him. He's a splendid person and was my father's best friend. Scarlett thought, what am I supposed to do? Give 3 cheers? For Charles' expression showed that he was bearing his heart secret to her. She could think of nothing to say, and so merely looked at him, wondering why men were such fools as to think women interested in such matters. He took her expression to mean stunned appropriation, and went on rapidly, daringly. If I went, would you be sorry, Miss O'Hara? I should cry into my pillow every night, said Scarlett, meaning to be flippant, but he took the statement at face value and went red with pleasure. Her hand was concealed in the folds of her dress, and he cautiously wormed his hand into it and squeezed it. Overwhelmed at his own boldness and at her acquisition. Would you pray for me? What a fool, thought Scarlett bitterly, casting a surreptitious glance about her on the hope of being rescued from the conversation. Would you? Oh, yes, indeed, Mr. Hamilton. 3 rosaries at night at least. Charles gave a swift look about him, drew in his breath, stiffened his muscles of his stomach. They were practically alone, and he might not get another such opportunity. And even given such God-sent occasion, his courage might fail him. Miss O'Hara, I must tell you something. I love you. Said Scarlett absently, trying to peer through the crowd of arguing men to where Ashley still sat, talking at Melanie's feet. Yes, whispered Charles, in a rapture that she had neither laughed, screamed, nor fainted, as he had always imagined young girls under such circumstances. I love you, you are the most, and he found his tongue for the first time in his life. The most beautiful girl I've ever known, and the sweetest and kindest, and you have the dearest ways, and I love you with all my heart. I cannot hope that you could love anyone like me, but my dear Miss O'Hara, if you can give me any encouragement, I will do anything in the world to make you love me. I will. Charles stopped, for he couldn't think of anything difficult enough of accomplishment to really prove to Scarlett the depth of his feelings. So he said simply, "I want to marry you." Scarlett came back to earth with a jerk at the sound of the word marry. She had been thinking of marriage and of Ashley, and she looked at Charles with poorly concealed irritation. Why must his calf-like fool intrude these feelings on this particular day, when she was so worried she was about to lose her mind? She looked into the pleading brown eyes, and she saw none of the beauty of a shy boy's first love, of adoration of an ideal come true, or the wild happiness and tenderness that were sweeping through him like a flame. Scarlett was used to men asking her to marry them, men much more attractive than Charles Hamilton, and men who had more finesse than to propose at a barbecue when she had more important matters on her mind. She only saw a boy of 20, red as a beet and looking very silly. She wished that she could tell him how silly he looked, but automatically the words Ellen had taught her to say in such emergencies rose to her lips in casting down her eyes. From force of long habit she murmured, "Mr. Hamilton, I'm not unaware of the honour you have bestowed on me in wanting me to become your wife, but this is all so sudden that I do not know what to say." And that's where we'll finish for today. And I'll do another one in a couple of days. That's fantastic. Hope to talk to you soon. Bye-bye for now.